Hi, and welcome to our today's webinar on application readiness. Just as a way of quick introductions, my name's Phil Mercer, so I like to kind of go by the name of business consultant, although I do kind of deliver many different roles at PowerON as I'm a commercial lead for the business. But essentially business consultant means I have a bit of a strap line where I say I'm technical but not the techie, so can support a good conversation. And I get involved a lot over the years with helping customers think about what they're doing, why they're doing it, and how is the best way then to try and tackle and approach that. Really we're specializing in a kind of a broad range of customer environments, but really in the workplace and data center for management and security solutions. The webinar today, as mentioned, is really looking at the application readiness within the framework of a move to Windows 10, as well as then that kind of ongoing thoughts around how we maintain. And the session forms part of an overall series where really following up on what we've spoken about in the first webinar, looking around upgrade readiness or Windows analytics, and how we can leverage that with Microsoft's modern desktop assessment, or which is now actually just been name changed to the Windows 10 assessment. And this will then kind of be followed up with, considerations around how we design, as well as with coping for that kind of management service and modern management updates. So as we begin the session today, really I wanted to kind of start to think a little bit around what is kind of a migration framework for Windows 10. Now, with this, of course, there are many different ways in terms of how you can tackle it, but we found with working with customers that this gives us a well-structured but equally kind of flexible kind of approach that allows us to address quite a pragmatic way of being able to deal with Windows 10. So the idea with respect to this is really around how we managing the transition to Windows 10, as well as then kind of thinking about how that might be affected if you want to transform as well when you are moving. But of course, we do have to be mindful of the current timelines of events. So this needs to be kind of considered to balance how much transformation you attempt to fit within your migration, because it's pretty typical that a lot of customers like to try and revolutionize things when they start to take Windows 10 and try and tackle everything that they haven't done for the last many years, as it kind of presents itself as a good opportunity. But certainly what I would say is, a principle of approach when we start to think about these things is consider what are you transforming versus what are you transitioning. And the less time that you have, the more you have to focus purely on transition rather than transform. But all of this then can be initially kind of thought and captured within, what you'd expect and kind of kicking that project off. So thinking about establishing your projects, your technical governance controls, but really what are your principles of approach? And I like to think about working backwards from when your actual end goal state is, because fundamentally that will drive that sense of urgency through the decisions that you make. Of course, that then will actually kind of go into an ongoing cycle of project control and review. And we always very much start with that discovery and alignment. And so as kind of mentioned in the earlier sessions, really starting to understand that high-level profiling and creation of your solution framework. So in this context, what is a solution framework referencing? We're talking around the different elements that are going to be required to provide functional readiness. So delivery of those kind of key component tasks or pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that you're going to need to ensure that your transformation can happen, or fundamentally your transition, depending on time that you are actually looking to deliver. By going through this, it gives you a strong kind of approach to ensure that when you actually start hitting production, then you're not going to necessarily hit into lots of unexpected issues, because you find out, say, 95% of those through a much more structured functional readiness and then kind of pilot testing and process validation. That isn't to say that you shouldn't obviously think about, the kind of elements that will come through, but rushing these early stages is certainly a heavy risk that needs to be considered. So although it can be quite typical that customers, once the decision has been made to move forwards, look to kind of jump straight into technical pilots, actually going through and performing these tasks up front is a vitally important side. Otherwise, you need to expect that you are going to hit issues, and that actually those issues will fundamentally make you slower and have a worse experience over the process of time. So once you've kind of gone through, as say, that functional readiness, which allows you to ensure that you are technically ready, that pilot testing and process validation allows you to kind of apply those technical elements against a testing set. you surely should consider using those testing sets against not just IT, because fundamentally that's not necessarily proving anything. You want to actually use that against a cross-section of your organization and really kind of getting what I kind of tend to refer to as the scenarios that are present. So what is a good, reasonable cross-section of the type of deployment experiences you have? Doesn't necessarily mean you have to have factored all the apps that you might be looking to deal with, because that's not necessarily the point, is you may be doing that over the course of time, and I'll talk to that in just a moment. But you are wanting to look to capture the operational procedures. So users that are on the move, users that are at fixed office locations, users that actually work from home constantly, or other kind of considerations such as 24/7 services or other bits and pieces like that, just to ensure that your process of approach will work, and that actually things like your application delivery is considered and will work. That then allows you to hit into that kind of production communications, which are obviously critical. So you've now got a strong understanding and confidence in terms of how your process will work, so you can really engage your audience and make sure that actually they understand it as well, so they're taking on that journey with you, where you then move through that managed migration and you kind of hit through the actual rollouts in a staged or a staggered phased rollout. And apologies. This is where we then kind of come to that application consideration as well. So, it's very common and equally realistic, is the only real way to do it, is that you will have application needs that you'll want to work through. So actually within that kind of discovery and alignment part, the point is also to understand your application estate to a degree where you can map those application needs against your staggered phased rollout, so that you can then also give yourselves time to work through the process of actual application readiness before and during the actual production rollout, so that you're always just that one step ahead of the next phase of your actual kind of transition that you're working through. And it must be then considered that actually, although you might then close down the Windows migration from a point of view of the actual migration, then this actually kind of converts into that operational management. And Windows 10 now has introduced a requirement on organizations that has never really been present previously: the need to be able to kind of maintain that transition through the course of time. So whereas typically, you'd be looking at this as every kind of 5 years on most customer organizations, or certainly, between 3 and 5 years normally, and some are slower than that, you would do a large transition, which will typically also be linked in with hardware refreshes. Now, really, we're seeing enterprise organizations need to look to do this on that recurring cycle, but on an annual kind of phase. So although Microsoft has introduced the biannual updates or current branch with respect to Windows, we really kind of start talking about this in terms of actually more that most enterprise organizations are choosing to sell on the 09 or the September release, which is the longer term support release relevant to Microsoft. And so it's just then, how do we actually then now start to handle our applications and our other considerations within the actual ongoing, as we can actually then manage those on an annual side. Now, when we start thinking then around actually more specifics, when we kind of consider functional readiness, so we talked a little bit around some of the discovery and the information that you can capture in our previous session. But actually then, what are those kind of key components? So, if we think primarily transition rather than transform, then, we're fundamentally looking at kind of 3 major pillars, if you will. From a technical aspect, this is important to say, because of course user change and readiness is an ever-present thing in all projects. But essentially then we're kind of looking at 3 key components. So application readiness, as we're going to be talking more through the course of this session today, where, kind of considerations for how we start to understand the applications within our estate, how we look to actually kind of streamline that and clean up maybe some of that kind of legacy debt or kind of backlog of maybe BAU tasks that we may not have actioned against our apps, and then how we want to start then making in the new world the applications ready for redistribution or distribution or updating in terms of the actual change within the operating system. That tied in, of course, with the actual image. So this is then kind of thoughts and considerations for how hardware and peripherals will be changing, what needs and integration points that might present both for the actual image itself, but also the applications that are sat within that, and of course the environmental testing, as many apps have integrations with peripherals or the image or the other bits and pieces as well. So considerations in terms of how those tie together. And of course, security is a key consideration with all of that, that we need to start to think around what is, the proportional approach. So many kind of times there's the security regulations that we try to adhere to, but equally we need to think about actually how is that going to work within respect of our users being productive whilst being secure by design. And of course, all of this then has to be managed through, the actual migration tooling. Gone are the days, really, although many customers still leverage it, but gone are the days in terms of where you can just kind of hire in 5, 10, 20 contractors and just send them around with a USB stick on an evening to essentially migrate your devices. Whereas that can be appropriate for a 5-year project, again, reinforcing that need for an annual kind of cycle. We need to look towards that more enterprise or modern tooling to give us the capabilities to manage that operating system deployment. There are considerations around how we're actually delivering apps and maintaining those within the customer environment or within our environment to our users. Also being mindful of coming back to that scenarios of use, as we can have a lot of mobility within organizations today. And fundamentally as well, for the user experience to be solid, how are we kind of working towards capturing and updating and restoring user settings and data, so that essentially, that kind of user working is very much on demand and always up to date, but equally always secure. So when we start to then focus a little bit more into the actual application readiness element of this work, many times that people will think to this in terms of desktop apps. But actually, when you start to look at it, there are really kind of 4 primary elements, if you will, with 3 main ones that we need to kind of think about and consider. So although it's very much true that desktop apps, which focus really on that kind of core, kind of typical installed line of business, Win32 or otherwise, applications will still be the bulk of what most customers experience and most customers need to work with. We do also need to consider that websites are an ever more present kind of requirement for this. Now, modern kind of SaaS applications are making it easier to work with, but there's still a lot of applications within businesses today that have dependencies on certain website or certain browser types or certain security bits and pieces as well. So, and they're not necessarily very easy to actually understand what exists within your organization. So being mindful of that and having a focus within your kind of migration project of how we're dealing with websites and what are we doing is an important part. Office files is certainly one as well that most people are aware of, but there isn't necessarily always a clean and easy answer to think about how we deal with Office applications, such as macros and other bits and pieces being embedded in Access databases or plugins that different applications use as well, are all things that we need to think about on how we contend with either at a technical level or at a business process level. And of course, considerations for the hardware. Depending on certain newer applications, they will introduce higher levels of requirements. Teams is a great example, a really popular application that's becoming ever more so and a fantastic tool for the business, but has a fairly heavy requirement on resources when you do the fuller installation if you want to have a good user experience. So understanding that kind of need of your applications and how then your hardware supports that is a crucial part in thinking about application compatibility, both hardware specification wise as well as then the integrations with the operating system and those extended peripherals and scenarios of use. So if we focus then a little bit towards the desktop applications, we've kind of looked at this in terms of over the many kind of different engagements we've done over the years in terms of really trying to have a good structure for this, because it can be very common that you'll have a massive sea of applications that are looked to be dealt with, but how do you actually really go around kind of staging what you do and where? So in terms of where that kind of road along the desktop applications readiness kind of starts, we kind of very much kind of think about that first round application readiness, or what I kind of tend to refer to many times as that first round of application readiness. So in terms of this, it's really starting to think around, I need to know what I'm working with. It's a fairly obvious statement to make, but equally it's something that, before you can really make money of your plans, you need to understand that current state of play. And when I kind of consider that first round, it's really due to the fact of how are we going to get that? Because not just knowing what is installed, but actually what is its state of readiness in terms of actually working with your new operating environment. And that's where, as the previous webinar will have talked to, Microsoft's done a fantastic job of really trying to introduce tools for customers that can help with this. And so really that kind of use of Windows Analytics, or upgrade readiness as it's commonly referred to, is really kind of a great starting point for this. That first round of what we're trying to do is understand what is installed across the base, how many installations of that exist within our kind of client base, but also then kind of dropping it into a traffic lighting system. So of the applications that we have out there, what really are the kind of the red, amber, greens, where we know we're going to have problems and we're going to need to think about it, where are the ones where actually there's not a level of clarity around what is or isn't needed in terms of the ambers. And apologies, where are we confident that actually those applications are already ready for deployment? Great news within respect to this compared to those that have been used to the Windows 7 and the XP type of days. Whereas in previous times it was probably 80-20, with 80% of them not working and needing a considerable amount of application reworking when introducing the new OS. In the newer worlds, although Microsoft optimistically presents a 99%. That figure is not necessarily so accurate in practical sense, as typically speaking, we kind of see 20% subs. So it's common that maybe 15% is the more common kind of numbers, where there are things where you'll need to take action to be able to kind of support that. And that first round of application readiness is going to give you that information, leveraging tools such as the free ones from Microsoft. Then it's starting to think around actually doing initial, what I would refer to as a technical rationalization of apps. Now, the important part here is, and the reason why I refer to it as technical, is that you should be able to rationalize your apps without requirements to speak to the business. So this is when starting to think about where is there kind of maybe obvious kind of cleanup actions, where are the things in respect of versions that you can upgrade that you are aware that you can upgrade without kind of licensing considerations or otherwise. And also, where are the kind of certain actions that you can do where you can take it based on what is the principles that you're applying to this. One of the things that can certainly be considered at this stage, or will need to be considered later, is it would be very common for you to have a large tail of applications. So, let's say you have 200 apps, roughly speaking. It's quite common that actually maybe 20 to 30 of those are the apps that really the business is considered key, and so those are the ones that are going to be installed across most of your user estate, and then the remaining 170 might have less than 10 installs within the business, but they're all kind of a range of applications that exist within the organization. Some organizations take the approach of actually saying, if it's less than 10 installs or less than 5 installs, we are not making it ready for Windows 10, and we'll allow users to re-request that application, and if there's a good reason why it exists, then we will deal with that. Others take obviously a more business engaged approach, and really that kind of tends to come down to time and costs and otherwise that can be considered. But dealing with that tail, going through the process of making those applications ready for the new world can be an expensive and lengthy process. So certainly, considerations there around how you also engage your business is a key one that you should think about there. As we then go through, then it's really hitting that second round of application readiness. So you've kind of taken the data, you've initially traffic lighted it, you've cleaned it up to the degrees to be able to kind of get more of a subset of what is then stuff to work on. And what we're really looking then to do within the second round application readiness is focus on those ambers, focus on those levels of unknown that, we're not necessarily clear. Now, there's differing toolings and a process and approach, but really this is going to fundamentally come down to having to go through a smoke testing exercise against those applications and really kind of test out, are they working? So that can either come down to a user or an IT team member go through manually installing those and seeing what happens within the respects. As I say, we use different tools both to kind of perform the smoke test in a structured way that allows us to do data capture. We have bulk loading and automation side, and there are many third-party vendors, in terms of that provide automated scanning of applications. But with that focus really on the ambers, the unknown sides, you can limit the elements of work that you need to do there and the costs that you need to expend to be able to actually go through those different parts. But what we're really looking to try and achieve within this stage is to actually then green light or red light any of the applications left, to be then left with a rationalized set where we understand what we know will work and what we know is going to need refactoring or repackaging in terms of making that ready. Now, once you've kind of got to that cleaned up estate and that understanding, this is where then, I'd kind of refer to the business stage of rationalization of applications. Now, this stage is an interesting one, and this is, kind of the kind of stage where a consultant will say, how long's a piece of string? Because, it's one of those where different levels of work and effort will go into this depending on how far you want to take it. The kind of considerations that you're starting to think about here is that when you change versions of applications, there may be considerations for usage. So, is this new application changing the way the app works? Is that going to affect my end user? And are they okay with that? So that kind of level of engagement with the business. Licensing implications and cost implications. There can be reasons why users have different variants of applications within their desktop because they're not currently licensed for that. Is the business going to accept new licensing costs or new kind of processes that are going to be kind of introduced at this point in time? Depending on your time, there is unfortunately no way of getting away from the fact that this is a relatively lengthy BA type task of going rounds. There are kind of processes to help streamline it, but really you are going to need to look towards going out and surveying your users and talking through that. Some customers, based on practicalities, can take an approach of, right now, I'm going to mirror the applications that my organization has based on that kind of initial technical rationalization which has gone through, because that is the choice that's pragmatic at the time to allow for speed, but also not to necessarily mean there's impacts caused to the organization. But this is certainly one to consider, and tend to be as well that, when you've gone through that point of, if you do choose to do a mirroring due to time constraints, then considering, what is the import then of actually maybe adding that business rationalization as a BAU task, and will you be able to do it? But obviously always being real of will it be done if it's added as a BAU task is certainly a consideration. But once you've gone through those stages of rationalization and readiness kind of assessments, you have a clear picture of what it's going to take to actually then kind of or what's going to be needed in terms of repackaging. And this ideally should be kind of a much smaller subset of your applications that are needing to be done, really focused off that red list in terms of making those green in terms of the actual processing. Again, there are many tools that can exist for this, but considerations typically where is missed is that there can be quite a lot of applications where users have installed manually. You might not have access to the original source files, so that kind of application discovery and action time is certainly something you need to think about, and the levels of effort and overhead that also introduces within a repackaging exercise. And that also ties in with the final stage really for that desktop apps of the deployment readiness. So again, there might have been a lot of apps that are green, but you don't have the original staged media, and they're not currently within your kind of enterprise tooling that you're using, or your deployment tooling that you're using. And so really in that, we're kind of taking now the applications that you have and ensuring they are made deployment ready, or which can sometimes be referred to as packaging, to be honest, but we tend to try and call it deployment readiness for clarity's sake, but making sure those apps are entered in to your actual system, your tool, kind of in a Microsoft world, we'll be talking things like System Center Configuration Manager, and then also appropriately applying the targeting of those apps based out to your users. Now, you'd apply that targeting based on, the kind of discovery information that you've previously captured. But, I like to also kind of start to think around how you can help clean that up by thinking around what apps are kind of across the business, what apps are across X department, and what apps are relevant to these groups of users. And then you consider whether those apps are mandatory installed or available to be installed as well. So we can give those kind of side of choices to our users. And then really, as I say, thinking about the principles of approach is key, in terms of that, how you can leverage and engage from a communications into your users to think about surveys through the rationalization processes, or just through, kind of different sides. So even at the business side, you can do basic kind of rationalization by sending surveys out and chasing down to kind of clean that up, or using communications out to the users to explain that actually, if it's less than 10 installs, we're not installing it. So, we are doing a cleanup of apps, and if there's applications you need to request that with a valid business rationale as to why you need it. And like I say, really making sure that you start to think about, you can do a lot of these tasks all manually, but there are a bunch of toolings out there to help support the process. And something Microsoft introduced as well, which is quite good, is they introduced something they called App. So we were on the early pilot processes when they were doing this a couple of years ago, really, when it started kind of kicking off, or a year and a bit ago. And the App program is for those customers that are managed by Microsoft. If you have an application that currently works on Windows 7 but won't work on Windows 10, and there isn't a updated version of that available from the vendor, then Microsoft will work with you to help you remediate and fix that application. It is important to say there are some caveats to their inclusions and their time and their support, but they are quite committed to helping customers work through any kind of application blockers. Mentioned before, and not to go over this in much length because obviously it was covered on the previous webinar, but things like upgrade readiness, it is a great tool really to assist with that. But also Microsoft have made and integrated into that tool, as well as just generally made available as a website, is if you have a bunch of kind of specialist custom ISV type apps, you can go to Ready for Windows and just kind of type in the application name, and it'll give you usage data and support statement information for that as well that can be useful. Through the process as well, there is, as you kind of probably guessed, there's lots of different data points to consider. We're talking maybe hundreds of different applications spread across thousands of different users, and how do you space those into the different deployment units? As a key point of this is actually how you map your workload of applications across the structure of your project, because if you were trying to do all your application readiness before starting your pilot, you might be waiting a reasonably long time for that. So naturally speaking, you also have to phase your application work once you've done those initial stages of readiness, when you actually get into repackaging and other bits and pieces. We certainly kind of use different toolings for that, and again, happy to give information, but essentially like a specialist command and control tool that acts as a data warehouse for it, allows us to pull in different compatibility information. The reason why I'm mentioning this is really the point of the tool is to help make sure that you can manage the different data points, as well as actually just structure a process around how you engage your business for the rationalization part. The rationalization is a critical component, and that understanding of what apps and how do you engage your users through communications and surveys and sign-off requests and things like that can really help in terms of actually your management and how you start to really tackle the applications within your estate. Now, that said, we obviously kind of did talk through things like the web application compatibility. Microsoft has certainly introduced this idea of Edge as their kind of key new browser, and upgrading web apps, to modern standards is certainly the best, kind of target of approach. But the kind of the challenge with Edge or other modern browsers is certainly that certain applications will just simply not work or not run within that. So, typically speaking, what would be kind of tied in with this is starting to think around actually where you can set profiles and provisions that if certain applications still require it, you have Internet Explorer deployed down alongside, which can work in terms of backward compatibility. There is enterprise modes within Edge and with the browsers, which actually can be very effective, but equally as well, it's just starting to think about how we set up and automatically switch, between the kind of the browser side of things. But I suppose one of the kind of key considerations with respect of this is just making sure that we start to gain an awareness of the web applications that are present within the business, have an approach where they'll either be considered to be okay, or where you can quickly get those web applications added to the enterprise mode, or the kind of the way that you plan to tackle those those applications when you're going through the migration itself. But also be mindful as well as actually those applications then do need to be remediated. So whether that's done prior or due to the fact that typically requires certain changes with the apps themselves, or there's going to be maybe new versions coming through, that allows you then to start to think about actually over the course of time, you phase those older web apps out, you move to newer SaaS options, and then you're allowed to basically get back to Edge or other modern browsers to support it. I think the biggest part of this really is just to kind of think about how do you first of all understand the web applications that you have in place, and either way just have a plan of how you will approach applications that will struggle with compatibility with new browsers. So have a process of approach that you can basically quickly adapt on the fly if you just need to change, because typically that can be then handled by sending out a GPO or other bits and pieces to basically be able to kind of make sure that your users, if affected, can be quickly remediated when you start to hit out into the production side of things. Office files is certainly a key one here. Now, I'm not necessarily going to labor the point on this, but Microsoft have provided, tools for this. They have the Office Readiness, which is equally getting integrated into tools like Windows Analytics or Desktop Analytics. But one of the key things that I tend to really want to make sure customers think about is Office Readiness is a tool that will help you understand what Office files are currently within your business that use macros. In itself, it's just providing you insight. It doesn't actually provide you with an answer. And so the unfortunate kind of reality is there is no easy fix to how you deal with macros. It can be situations where actually your users that created the file originally no longer work within the business, or just simply, even if they do, they might have to rebuild the service because there is just no easy fix. Now, what I will say is the Office Enterprise compatibility modes and other bits and pieces are very good for backwards support and compatibility, but essentially, there isn't necessarily going to be always an easy fix. The easiest way to start to handle that is if there is an Office file that is discovered that requires it. We very typically will provide customers the ability to kind of roll out Office 2013 or 2010, depending on support needs, using App V. And then those older files are targeted, and we'll normally kind of look towards getting the business to kind of set an internal policy that if you are on older file sets, that you'll get a year to essentially kind of migrate or move your user sets off. And there does then need to be some internal IT policies said that if you're customizing Office files, that either is a non-supported option, or because a lot of the times these are actually key files or key services that departments like finance are using, then you need to just consider they will have a cost for maintenance and support. Rebuilding macros is not necessarily a heavy, technically complex task, but it does require power user skills, but also a good, solid understanding of the actual element or service that you are trying to achieve. So, considerations around how you handle it can be certainly there, but, certainly an easy way of just handling it in a short-term basis to be able to provide an option to not delay your migration is thinking about how you might use Microsoft App V with an older version of Office to be deployed down within the appropriate kind of training communications to those users that are running older files to be able to support that. So we've talked through, numerous parts of some of the parts and really tried to help give some of the theory in terms of this. And, we've kind of really talked around, how am I going to get there, in terms of Windows 10. And just really kind of some of the things to consider and processes of approach that you can start to use within your application side of things when planning for this. But equally, as we mentioned as well, feature updates are coming, and that continually requirement to assess and update is going to be there. And, not certainly going to look to answer that question for you today, but this is where, as we go through the rest of the webinar series, we will look to think about this. Microsoft have made significant strides in actually making it a lot easier and a lot better for compatibility, and the expectation is that compatibility issues will be significantly lower between feature versions and even to the degrees of being able to eliminate by moving to modern application formats like MSIX or otherwise. But just really to kind of keep in the back of your mind that getting to Windows 10 is one thing, but also then thinking around how you plan for staying there and keeping up to date is certainly, something where think about how you identify leveraging those tools like Upgrade Analytics and the new stuff that's coming through with Desktop Analytics, how you prioritize and have structured testing, as well as just kind of working towards how you manage those pilots or kind of waves of rollouts for your ongoing operational process. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to us today. I do hope you found this of value. If there is any questions that you do have or you'd like to send them through, then please just let us know. Either contact us at info@PowerON or through your account manager, or certainly be happy to kind of just give us a call and we'll kind of take it from there. I do thank you for your time today, and I hope you've enjoyed the session. Thanks very much.